Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Wednesday, January 3rd, 2024 City Council Planning, Development, and Environment Committee meeting. My name is Councilmember Hunt, and I am here tonight with Council President Walsh. Councilmember Zach Hall is also a member of this committee, but he has an excused absence this evening. We have multiple public comment opportunities tonight. One of them will be now before our items of business. And so at this time, I will check in. I will mention from the record that there are no members of the public in council chambers this evening. And at this time, I will check in with the city clerk if there are any members of the public wishing to make comments in the virtual meeting. And if so, I will read some more information.
Chair Hunt, we have one virtual attendee, but I don't see a hand raised indicating the desire to speak.
Okay. Well, as a reminder, there will be another public comment opportunity later in the meeting. So I will also call for public comment after that item. The first thing we will do is approval of the minutes. We have minutes from November 8th, 2023. Do we have any corrections or changes to those meeting minutes? All right, then move to approve the meeting minutes of November 8th. Please indicate by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
That passes, and thank you. Now we will get to our first and only agenda item, which is ID 1493, Comprehensive Plan Update, SEPA Scope Review, and this will be presented by Long Range Planning Manager Stephen Padilla. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Chair Hunt. A moment to pull up my slides. Thank you. Tonight, as you said, we're going to talk about the environmental impact statement scoping process and take committee members' feedback on the scoping on how to approach the EIS for the comprehensive plan and potentially get any additional topics to analyze as part of the EIS as well. We have 3 questions for the committee members tonight. First is, are there topics not listed that should be addressed in the EIS? Are there additional concerns that should be considered as part of the EIS? And are there changes to the proposed alternatives that we presented in tonight's meeting that we should consider for the EIS analysis? As a little background information, I'm going to dive into what is the EIS, what's the requirement behind it, and what the EIS is required by the State Environmental Policy Act, which is state requirement to do environmental analysis for government decisions and projects that could look at environmental potential mitigation for the effects. The environmental impact statement, which I'm calling the EIS tonight, describes or looks into those different topics for analyzing the environmental impacts and potential mitigation and significant impacts as a result of a government decision or project. The many topics that are required to be looked at in the EIS includes a lot of the topics for the comprehensive plan in line with the elements in the comprehensive plan, as well as a few additional topics, including displacement analysis or different types of services that should be analyzed with growth as the different alternatives for the EIS. As required by the state, the EIS has to go through a scoping period. We initiated that scoping period at the end of November, and it'll end at January 5th, this Friday. We held an open house on December 7th at the Issaquah Community Center. And then we also held the same night, Planning Policy Commission discussed the same topic and take public comment. And then the total comments that we received is about 25 individual comments throughout the open house, the online comments that we received, and email comments that we received, in addition to the PPC comments from the meeting on the December 7th. Generally, the feedback we received is there was some concerns around emergencies and preparedness for natural disasters as it relates to growth and access to resources. There is general concern around affordable housing citywide, as well as regionally in terms of how the city is providing affordable housing along with our regional partners. Traffic, again, is always a concern when it comes to growth. we received some comments along engineering standards and aligning them with neighborhood need. Environment is also a big concern at the open house from the Planning Policy Commission, as well as emailed comments that we received in terms of how we are addressing climate change with our regional partners, how we're addressing environmental justice and access, as well as considering the city should consider higher growth targets as part of this EIS. Just for context, our city growth targets were adopted in 2021, and we use our 2019 baseline numbers. So in addition to the baseline numbers for housing of 17,000, we expect or have a target of 3,500 housing units by 2044, as well as 7,900 jobs in addition to the 2019 baseline by 2044. Now, to help us put together the different alternatives, we wanted to take a look at what's actually going in the pipeline and what's been constructed, what's in our permitting process, what's in the development agreements, what do we see as projected growth with what we have now to help us determine how to better analyze different growth alternatives for this EIS. And so what you can see is what we've seen since 2019 is we've seen a little over 1,100 housing units constructed in the city. We have 118 housing units currently under permit review. We also have 360 housing units under construction. And then under our development agreements, we potentially have an additional 3,500 housing units coming in by 2044. And so by 2044, just using these pipeline and construction numbers, as well as the development agreements, we are expecting just over 5,000, 5,100 housing units by 2044. Oh, and one note on the agreements. So we looked at the development agreements for Shelter, Raleigh, and Lakeside, and then the TOD project, which isn't necessarily a development agreement, but we have an agreement with the county that'll look at additional housing units in the Regional Growth Center. So the alternatives that we're wanting to discuss with the committee tonight is in line with much of what we looked at from the pipeline numbers and construction, as well as what was in the development agreements, using different assumptions. So for the first alternative, alternative A, we are looking at a total housing growth of 3,500 units in the next 20 years. This assumes that the numbers in the pipeline are going to be maintained. Everything in the under review and permits or under construction will be maintained, but it's only assuming partial build out of the development agreements. And this also doesn't assume any additional growth in addition to what's in the pipeline now. And that'll help, that is what'll get us to the growth of 3,500. Using that, that means we will have majority growth outside of the central Issaquah Valley, and only 40% within central. For alternative B, we increase the total housing units to 5,500. And doing that, we assume that the development agreements will get fully built out. We also assume that there will be some minor projects within the Regional Growth Center for additional housing, but it still maintains majority growth, minor majority outside of. And then for the third alternative, alternative C, we increase the total housing to 6,800 housing units. This also assumes maintains the pipeline housing units, as well as assumes the development agreements get fully built out. But it also assumes additional growth within the Regional Growth Center and more growth actually outside of the Regional Growth Center in central Issaquah. But these assumptions get us to the majority growth within central Issaquah by 2044. Next steps for the EIS is we'll be bringing, or for the comprehensive plan, we'll be bringing the economic vitality element draft to this committee in February, and then we'll be bringing the Parks, Human Services, and Cultural elements to the Services, Safety, Parks Council Committee in February. And then the expected draft release for the EIS will be in the second quarter this year. concludes my presentation. I'm joined by Mandy Roberts and potentially just Mandy Roberts, one of our consultants helping us with the EIS analysis, and she'll help me field any questions.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any questions? Council President Walsh.
Thank you. So I had emailed in a few, but I just want to kind of have some of that conversation on record. So you mentioned the 3 development agreements and then the TOD project. And can you bring up the numbers that are shown for what the growth rate? Yeah, so you've got 3,500, and we've had development agreements in the past when we've talked about comp plans, but they've always had future end dates. So we haven't known when the growth would happen. But I had asked you when the end dates are for each of these, and you had said 2038, 2044, and 2043. So is there any reason that we wouldn't expect to see those 3,500 units be built? I mean, wouldn't they basically be giving up what is their right?
It's their right, but it's also based on the market in terms of cost and viability for the project and how they're going to be able to maximize their profits for them in terms of what's feasible for them to be able to develop within the time frame of the development agreement. So for the purposes of the EIS, we wanted to take a conservative approach and just make sure that we have the capacity to be able to accommodate these projects if they do fully build out. But typically, we don't always see these development agreements fully build out as they're outlined or allowed to do within.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think many of the development agreements we've dealt with have been single-family homes, and those have all gotten built out and more. But these are slightly different scenarios. Okay. And then I kind of asked what's the impact of choosing to go after smaller versus larger targets in this? Are there any limitations that puts us under? What's the financial impact for the city? How should we go about evaluating those?
So for the EIS, when we are looking at the larger growth projections or slightly larger growth projections, we'll have to analyze any potential impacts on our infrastructure, any potential needs that haven't been looked at, or any potential significant impacts that aren't recognized within our CIP, and be able to address that if that's the projected growth that we want to plan for. And so by a smaller growth projection, we'll actually be looking at what potential mitigation projects we don't need versus the larger projections. We'll need to look at things that we haven't looked at before. And so that would be kind of the difference of how we're going to be analyzing them. Both will come with different costs within the EIS analysis, but we'll be able to, but the additional analysis is going to be looked at within the modeling in terms of what can be accommodated. And I'll go to Mandy Roberts, one of our consultants, to kind of add to my response.
Thank you, Stephen. I wasn't sure if you could see my hand raised. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good. Yeah, I just wanted to add in to Stephen's explanation, which was really thorough, but just that doing the environmental impact statement gives us the opportunity to analyze a reasonable range of alternatives under the State Environmental Policy Act, SEPA. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that any one of these 3 would be, the exact or ultimate future, but it does give us opportunity to analyze these 3 different possibilities and through a public document, gather additional comments on that, look at different impacts to traffic, transportation, utilities, and whatnot. So it's really just, wanting to brief you on these alternatives and get a sense of how you're feeling about these for further study. So just wanted to add that in. Thank you.
Okay, and I had one other question. So this is looking at a period of 25 years, starting back in 2019. And we've obviously already constructed. I had asked for the number of average units that we have grown over the last 5 years and 10 years. You said 270 and 287 units per year. Obviously, we're in a different financial scenario right now, but we don't know what the financial scenario is going to be within all of these 25 years. Is there a reason we wouldn't just assume or try to predict that we will grow at about the same rate or even more, since there's such a high demand for housing going forward?
I think the main reason we would want to go for a higher growth alternative is that if we do at one point exceed that growth projection, we would need to do another EIS to analyze what those impacts might be. But if it's within the range of what we're considering within this EIS, we don't need to redo it, and we actually have looked at the environmental impact as part of the conference.
Well, let me clarify. 270 units per year over 25 years is 6,750, which would be toward the high range of what we've projected. So one of the things I'm trying to get at is, are we maybe looking too low given our past growth rate over not just the last 5 years, but the last 10 years, and considering we're looking at more potential multifamily, which is going to be a higher number of units per acre? I'm wondering whether the numbers suggest that there could be higher numbers coming in.
We can definitely look at a higher number for the EIS. There's nothing holding us back. The main thing is we were trying to pull the numbers from what we see kind of in our permitting process and development to kind of get us to our projected growth alternative.
Good evening, council members and any members of the community. I want to add to that is I would caution us taking, we can analyze a much higher growth pattern. Under the state law, we only have to plan for 3,500. And that means not just the planning exercise, but do we have the water and the sewer capacity to serve these places? So we don't want to build reservoirs that aren't going to get used. So I think from a planning perspective, that's the growth targets are done with the analysis at a whole region, sub-region, and then the county gets its share and the cities get this share. So these forecasting models work at that much larger regional scale for each city to determine what your growth is going to be. We can, we don't control the market. Some of it will be driven by market and such. So I would caution council from going even larger than 6,800 at this time for the EIS process. We're happy to add that if you think we need to explore that option. But I think that's almost twice the amount of 3,500 that the city is required.
Okay, that was kind of what I was trying to pick at with what are the pros and cons of choosing high versus low, and what it means if we set something either too low or too high. And I think your comment about water and building towers and all of that gives me a sense of, hey, there could be problems if we set something too high, and like a school district that is decreasing in enrollment, overbuild, and then not have the housing to deal with that. Thank you. That's the end of my questions.
And then I do have a hand from our consultant, Mandy, if you don't mind her adding into the response. Go ahead, Mandy.
Yeah, is it okay if I tag on? Thanks, Stephen. I just wanted to reiterate, I believe you said it earlier, but cities are required to update their comprehensive plans every 10 years. And so that will be another opportunity. The city will be monitoring what growth happens over the next 10 years, and approaching that timeline, things can be adjusted at that point if it looks like you're going to, exceed your 20-year targets. So that's just sort of a stop-fail, I guess, or a stopgap that is built into the process, that every 10 years we take a fresh look at this. So just wanted to mention that too.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, I had a very similar question. We had a comment from the community meetings that was the suggestion that we should consider higher growth targets. I don't think I fully understand the answer because if we're considering alternatives, those alternatives are not, as was stated earlier, none of them are going to be exactly what ends up happening. So if we have an alternative, larger population-wise than growth-wise than what ends up happening in the future, that doesn't mean that we necessarily build out the infrastructure to support that alternative that doesn't happen. So I'm not sure that I understood your concern about choosing one alternative that is higher than our target. My understanding right now is we don't have any alternatives that we're considering higher than our target.
Yeah, I think what I was getting at is, for transportation model update, I mean, that's a pretty expensive study for the city to undertake. If our assumptions are really high, we'll be spending a lot of planning exercise for the trips that may or may not be the reality. So I think so that was one piece. So planning for infrastructure for this larger growth alternative, we have to pick an alternative. We can analyze the three, but we're going to have a preferred alternative for our comp plan. Is that correct? Mandy or Stephen, through this exercise?
Usually, if I could speak to that, usually we go through the analysis process and gather public and agency comments on the EIS, and then the city will choose a preferred direction to be reflected in the comprehensive plan. Yeah.
So for the initial stage, if you want us to explore a much higher growth, we can do it, but at the end of the day, the preferred selected option, the city has to use those studies and analysis to plan for that infrastructure to be in place if that growth comes our way.
And I would just add, correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen, but I believe two of the alternatives are higher than are the targets that we're required to plan for. Is that correct? In housing
That
units
is correct.
anyway?
Yeah.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So we already are looking at higher than the targets we've been allocated by the region. And we think that's a healthy, reasonable thing to do, given the growth trends as was mentioned earlier, so, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, there's a sentence here which is all alternatives consider the Central Issaquah EIS and do not exceed the preferred alternative. So I think that was where I was thinking that was the target, but it's the preferred alternative currently. Okay. So we're already assuming that the preferred alternative, we already have it assumed preferred alternative.
For Central Issaquah, yes.
Okay.
When the Central Issaquah plan was developed, it had its own EIS conducted, and so the preferred alternative was closer to about 8,500 units for Central.
Okay. And realistically, then, for the alternatives that we're considering, we don't think there's value to going higher than.
At this time, no.
Okay. Okay. Then my other question is, there were a number of comments from the community about different topics that they were interested in making sure were represented. You had a slide on that earlier. By your perception, do you think that all of those items would be incorporated into the comp plan process and the EIS, or are there things here that are not part of the EIS, but that could be?
I think for the most part, a lot of these will be considered to an extent as part of the EIS, but to fully address a lot of these topics, they're going to need to be considered within the functional plans for those specific topics. A lot of them are, at least the responses to some of these are going to require a little more detail than what we normally would look at for the EIS for the comprehensive plan. We primarily are trying to look at the infrastructure needs behind a lot of it, more so than how we're going to achieve a lot of the detailed things.
Okay. just looking at this list, and I did read the detailed comments, and it seems like there was a lot of really good discussion, which is part of why I'm trying to clarify if this will be incorporated. So the one, aligning standards with neighborhoods, that does seem like that's potentially something that would be in the comp plan, but not in the EIS. And then the other one, the consider higher targets, we already talked about that one, but the other ones on this list too. Is that fair?
Yes, yeah. Particularly the alignment standards with neighborhoods, we kind of looked at that as in terms of looking at our development standards, alignment with the comprehensive plan. So that is something will look at as part of the EIS, but the specific needs for specific standards for each neighborhood is not something.
But is part of comp plan in general.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. My last question is about the emergency planning. How does that factor in, and how do we factor in that in combination with climate change?
I have Mandy jump in on responding to this question.
Okay, and when you're speaking about emergencies, are you specifically speaking about emergency shelter provisions that will be required to meet, or more climate resiliency?
I am thinking of all manner of disaster preparedness.
Okay. So in a couple of ways. One, the county has allocated to all the cities within the county different levels of sheltering that need to be provided. So numbers of shelter units in each community that need to be provided for different purposes. And so we'll be analyzing those that are required for Issaquah and how those might be met. And it can be, that hotels can be converted for that purpose. So there's just some state requirements that we need to make sure our zoning supports and aligns with on human sheltering. And that's kind of also pertinent when we look at different affordability levels of housing. We'll be looking at that on the income bands analysis. In Issaquah, we'll be looking to make sure that that housing supply over time will help to meet the different demands within income levels. So the shelters is kind of part of that analysis too, the units related to permanent and temporary shelter. And then there is a new state law related to planning for climate and resiliency. It actually won't require Issaquah to do detailed planning right away. I believe it's 2029, if I'm remembering it right, Stephen. But what we are going to do is start thinking about that now with this comp plan update and be ready with some kind of early policy planning to move forward in earnest when we're required to do that at the next comp plan update. So we can, I want to research that a little bit more on the dates and what's required, but we can bring that back at a future meeting for you. But that would be planning for all manner of things related to climate change as part of, protecting and serving the community.
Okay. Thank you. And I believe there were also comments on schools and school capacity from the community. How is that factored in?
So schools are considered part of the public services, but because of how our state mandates school planning, it will look at it at a very high level, but it's more of the coordination of schools that the city actually has control over. And so that's some of the component we'll be looking at with the EIS.
Okay, thank you, Council President Walsh.
Thanks. When we are looking at the proposed growth alternatives, it sounds like we're not just choosing a number based on what we think is going to happen or anything like that. We're also, in some ways, choosing where that growth is going to happen, because I assume you need that in order to study to do the transportation analysis and all of those things. Okay, just kind of making sure that I'm hitting the right concept there.
Yes, that's correct. It's helping us kind of develop our assumptions of how that growth will happen with the city. That'll help us look at the models a little differently within each alternative.
Okay. And then is there, in the urbanist mindset and community, there's been a lot more conversation toward mixed use and creating areas where people don't have to take their car and drive across town to get groceries or any of that. I assume we can't study a concept like that in an EIS and have that affect our results here, because it would obviously affect transportation and all of that, because we haven't zoned necessarily that as a requirement. Is that correct?
Yes, within our traffic model itself, it actually does make an assumption on how many within the growth that we're assuming for like Central Issaquah, what percentage of that is actually going to be turned into vehicle trips versus multimodal trips. And so that is kind of accommodated a little bit within our traffic model already, but beyond that, it doesn't make any additional.
Okay. And there's no way to push that higher, the multimodal higher in this analysis, because it would require the assumption that we've made some sort of land use change that would enable that type of scenario, either vertical mixed use or requiring, you know.
Yes, we could make that assumptions, but then we would look at what regulatory needs to be able to accommodate it.
Okay. Yeah, good. Thank you.
Okay. So this is not something that you're asking for feedback for, but I am wondering, after you do the analysis, what do you look at for which one you determine is the preferred, and is there a policy conversation around that at a later stage?
At a later time, we'll have a policy discussion about which one will be our preferred.
Okay, great. I think that was my last question. Do you have any more questions? No? Okay. Great. So at this point, we will check in with public comment in case there are any members of the public that are wishing to give a comment on this item. I will mention again, there's nobody in council chambers. City Clerk, is there anyone online that might wish to make a comment?
Chair Hunt, we have one virtual attendee still, but I see no indication that they wish to speak at this time.
Okay. I'll just give a minute. Okay. All right, then we will move into our discussion. And I think it would be helpful if you could put the questions that you want us to give feedback on in the presentation. The first one is, are there topics not listed that should be addressed in the EIS analysis? President Walsh?
Sure. I think the concept of multimodal transit and kind of how, like I was kind of trying to hint at, I think when I'm looking at this concept for the next 25 years, I do think that other than our development agreements, we're going to see a lot more of our development happen in the central Issaquah area. So part of that, I think, necessitates this concept of more multimodal and how that affects our transportation grid, our transit usage, and all of those areas. So I would be very interested to see, particularly if we look at some of these alternatives and say, okay, one of these is going to be more suburban, one of these is going to be more central Issaquah focused. What are the differences we see between them? Because I think that's an important concept as we're studying each option.
Okay, great. My thought on this one is I understand that the school capacity is interrelated, but not exactly part of this analysis. I do think it's very important to work closely with the schools, to be communicating with them about what our growth projections are and what that means for housing and where we think that housing is going to be, so that it helps them do their planning, because I know they're very invested in making sure that there's adequate capacity for schools, and to be a good partner to them. That communication is super important. The other thing on this, it was listed, but just to put a finer point on it, I do think we're increasingly in a part of the country that is at risk for things like wildfire. Due to climate change, we've seen our risk of that increase, and we have neighborhoods that are at the wildlands urban interface. So I would like to consider, and this seems like a good vehicle for considering this, consider the evacuation routes, the capacity we have for making sure that people are able to respond, and that we have a resilient community in the case of those climate disasters that the reality is we are increasingly at risk for with climate change. So I think that would be good to get more information on, and I know earlier in the meeting you mentioned that you would look into that and what those planning are, but that would be something I would add. Have anything else on that one? No. Okay. Second one, well, first I'll just check in. Do you have what you need on that?
Yes, I do.
Great. Okay, the second one is, are there additional concerns that should be considered as part of this EIS analysis?
I'm not sure I understand the difference between concerns and topics. Is there some specific type of feedback you're looking for there?
It was more on how the EIS was being conducted more so than the topics. Is there something that we're just not looking at, is in terms of how we're collecting public engagement for the EIS scoping? Is there concerns on how we're going to be analyzing, or something that we're not analyzing as part of the EIS? There is overlap between the two questions, but it was more focused on the EIS as a whole.
Okay. I don't think I have anything additional there.
I also don't have anything additional there. And then, are there changes to the proposed alternatives?
So I think I've hit on it several times. It's just, I want to be prepared for whatever potential growth we're looking at, particularly as we look at these different AMI growth levels and the potentially smaller units that could come in as a result of that. So I think if I'm looking at the various alternatives, I'd like to see maybe something in between B and C that assumes more of the growth within central Issaquah. I think it's, as much as we're going to redo this in another 10 years, and so the scope of transit as a light rail station comes after that, if we are truly looking at this 25-year period, I would assume that we're going to see growth toward the end of that, particularly in the central Issaquah area around a transit station. And so if we're kind of looking at what our long-term future vision for the city is, I really think that should be more of the concept that we're looking at. I also think that we should assume pretty standard that we're going to see full build out of the development agreements, particularly because we've seen lots of action with Shelter and Lakeside recently, and we have quite a bit of control over the TOD project. I think all of those in combination, plus our 270 units average annually, leads me toward this concept that I think we're likely closer on the B2C alternatives and more toward central Issaquah. So that's where my mindset goes.
Just for a quick clarification, alternative C does it does assume all the pipeline projects, full build out of all the DAs, and significant growth primarily just in central Issaquah. Are you asking to increase that total number a little more so we have more growth in central, or the concept of C probably might be closer to what you're looking for?
I think I'd probably have to math that out because I know some of the development agreements actually, most all of the development agreements are outside of central Issaquah. So is the 45% of that 6,800 basically just the external development agreements plus some House Bill 1110 type of growth?
It's about 1,300 units in the Regional Growth Center and then 700 in the rest of Central is what it assumes. So that total about 2,500 in Regional Growth Center and 1,100 in the rest of Central, which is 400 more than what's in the pipeline for the rest of Central and about 1,000 more in the Regional Growth Center.
Okay. Yeah, I think what you're getting at there is C is probably more what I think would happen over a 25-year time period.
Okay.
I just don't know if B is, maybe what I'm looking at there is, I think it should be a little bit more in central Issaquah.
Okay.
But I don't know what your thoughts are.
When you were developing this list, were there other alternatives that you thought through but then decided not to do, or was this pretty much the list that came to mind of likely scenarios?
We considered all other alternatives. We considered an alternative where growth, the 20-year growth for like B happened within 10 years instead of 20 years. We also considered higher alternatives, but we didn't want to Minnie's point, we didn't want to sway too far above what we already have in the pipeline, just because we'll be looking at projects that we have no idea whether they're going to happen, whether we know within the DAs and what's in the pipeline, they're likely going to happen, just we need to stay within that ballpark.
I think all three alternatives are going to assume House Bill 1110 growth.
Yes.
So that's already factored in all three of them because, but how much, you don't know. The other thing, I think the city's planning efforts with Central Issaquah are great. We want all the energy to be focused on the planning for that to become real. It's a matter of time. So this is a 20-year growth. When light rail comes, maybe with the next cycle of the comp plan updates, that becomes more of a, that the numbers would skew more towards Central, perhaps. That time, I think the numbers, because of these larger DAs, really make it look like there's growth happening outside Central, but its majority of it is, concentrated in one or two areas because of the larger sites and the DAs. I think in all of them, the assumption still is 45% of 3,500 is a lot of units. Will still are being assumed in the Central.
Okay, I was just looking for this, but do you know what the estimated impact of 1110 is supposed to be? I've read that it will be modest. That's why I'm asking.
Mandy, could you speak to what you're seeing in other cities in terms of what they're assuming from impacts from House Bill 1110?
Yes, that is a question that is on everyone's mind, and we have some sub-consultants who will actually be supporting some of the work here in Issaquah as well, who've been studying that and looking at trends in other communities that have increased single-family densities and added ADU capabilities. What we're hearing, and we'll be kind of looking at this more specifically for Issaquah, but over a 20-year period, it's what communities are typically seeing is about a 2 to 5% increase, which is not substantial in specifically single-family units in single-family zoned areas. And there are areas of zoning that are exempt, for example, plats and subdivisions and master plan communities that have CC&Rs that specifically prohibit more than one unit per lot or ADUs. Those would all be exempt areas from the House Bill 1110 legislation. So it is really expected, and I know Issaquah has a lot of places that have regulations like that. Critical areas is another thing that tends to constrain the possibility of increasing density on single-family lots. So we'll be taking a closer look at that, but I think as you characterized it, it's not expected to be highly impactful to a community like yours over the next 20 years. But definitely something we need to think about and plan for, and to the extent kind of think about just the design and how those types of integrating of single-family units into subdivisions can look, and how it should fit into the look and character of each neighborhood. Aesthetic character of each neighborhood is important too. So, yeah, hopefully that helped to answer your question.
Council President Walsh.
Thanks. Director Dhaliwal, you said something like this concept of, yes, in 10 years when we do the next comp plan, we'll have a little bit more certainty about transit and light rail and what type of development will happen out there. How should I think about choosing an alternative if this is supposed to be for a 25-year comp plan when we really only have a lot more certainty about the next 5 to 10 years? Do we short that number, or does it make sense to really go after the full 25 and potentially overbuild?
Well, we have to plan for 2024. It's a 20-year plan, so it is a long-range look at whether are we prepared to address with our infrastructure, with all of these things that we have in place for this amount of growth to come in. And that's the 3,500 number. Beyond that, it's up to us for you all to see. We know this is looking more like a reality, and we think it's worth spending the city's money to do these analysis for traffic, for utilities, and plan for in that area. Now, the way the numbers are, the pipeline projects that Stephen shared, those are the DAs and things like that. The stuff along Central, the city's already done the planning for it. Since 2013. So if the growth were to happen, we have a planned action SEPA already done for Central Issaquah. So, and it's a designated growth center. So we do want to recognize some of the planning effort that the city has done in the past and anticipate that will come. It's a matter of time when that happens. We're making an assumption that it will get started by 2044. We'll have some of that. How much is sort of the part that we're trying to be realistic about it, and yet have the capacity exists. Whether the market will deliver it at this point, at what point will we start seeing that growth projection? Those are all some of the assumptions factored into all of the alternatives. But we can add another alternative if council desires. We're happy to make a fourth alternative. It can be based on your feedback today. We can consider that as well.
No, I think I'm just kind of getting my mind around why we choose one versus the other. I think, first of all, knowing that we're going to do another study in 10 years, and so if we're off, we're not affecting any of our ability to get at some of these things, because the areas that we're going to be off are going to be in the latter 10 years of this concept. And then knowing that all of these are just alternatives that we study as concepts so that we can be prepared for any of the utility work or any of those things, but that we also do that based on what's the pipeline of development coming in actuality as well. I actually feel pretty comfortable with these, having talked through those options, especially knowing that we've already done the EIS for Central Issaquah because of the growth area. So thank you.
Okay. I also think that there's been thought and analysis and consideration of other alternatives, and reasons why those other alternatives didn't make the final list. So I'm good with the list on the HB 1110 because there is sometimes information about that in the community. I do think it's important to give a estimate with numbers behind it about what we expect that impact to be. I think it was mentioned 2% or so, and so it's expected to be a small impact on those neighborhoods that are outside of the Central Issaquah area. So since there's discussion on that, I wanted to make sure that we did clarify that those are the estimates. There's also, I found there's PSRC estimates that they've done about the impact, and like I said, I think it's very modest, even in the high scenarios, what they expect that those bills do. It does give landowners more ability to make decisions that would add ADUs, for example, but again, modest overall impact in the big scheme of where we expect growth to be. Like I said, I think that the proposed alternatives are good, and I think thought went into it, and I'm satisfied with that. Is there anything else that we want to give feedback on? Do you have what you need?
We do.
Okay, great. Then with that, that is our only item of business. So do we have any announcements? There are no announcements. Then with that, this meeting is adjourned at 7:22 p.m. Thank you, everyone. Good night.